Welcome, everybody, to our fourth episode in the Financial Poise series, Life Sciences and the Law. This episode focuses on how to fund your life sciences startup. This is always a very popular topic for obvious reasons. We're in an industry that requires a lot of capital to get a product to market. Not every stakeholder is the right fit for the blend of high risk and high reward presented by life sciences companies, so it can be harder for life sciences companies to find this money. Products take years to get to the market, and it takes an enormous amount of capital to get those products to the market. However, at the same time, there are some sources of funding that are available to life sciences companies that aren't available to other companies like tech companies. We've got the traditional sources of funding that are available to startups, and we'll talk more about those. But some of those other sources include things like grants from various government agencies, grants from charities, collaborative partnerships, and we'll talk about all those too. Before we get started, let me make some introductions. The webinar is being brought to you by Financial Poise, which provides practical and entertaining education for attorneys and accountants, business owners, executives, and investors. You can read more about Financial Poise on slide 48. Our panelists today are Deb Hemingway, Managing Partner of Ekfora Capital, Elizabeth Smith, Chief Business Officer of Fizata, Zach Mueller, an attorney with the law firm of Foley Hoag, and Steve Ferguson, who's a longtime advisor to startup life sciences companies. I'm Jay Riley. I'm a corporate partner at Foley Hoag in the licensing and emerging companies practice groups. You can see our names on slide 5. You can read our bios on slides 42 to 46. Neither Financial Poise nor we intend for this to be an infomercial of any way. So we're not going to take 10 minutes with introductions telling you about ourselves. We're going to dive right into the content. So if you want more information about us and who we are, feel free to just look at the bio slides at the end of the presentation. Just one word about the slides. We do have a slide deck. We've put together a slide deck. It'll be available, but we're not actually going to be going through this presentation slide by slide. The presentation is going to loosely follow the order of the slides. I'll try to call your attention to slides that are relevant whenever we're talking about them. But this really is going to be more of a discussion amongst us panel members. If you're listening but not watching the seminar, you're going to be just fine, because the slides are absolutely not critical to an understanding of what we're going to be talking about today. I want to give a shout out to our co-producer, the National Law Review. It's thanks to the National Law Review that we're able to be here today doing this for you. You can read more about the National Law Review on slides 3 and also again on slide 47 of the deck. The last thing that I want to point out to you before we begin is a disclaimer on slide 4. This is actually very important. You're not our clients. You're not, we're not your lawyers. What we're doing here today is for general education. It's not for you to act on any of the advice or any of the topics that we covered today without really going to your investment professionals or your legal professionals and getting their advice directly. So without further ado, let's dive in. Elizabeth, let me start with you. We often hear about dilutive and non-dilutive financing. What exactly do those terms mean? What's the difference between dilutive and non-dilutive financing? And for those of you who are following along on the deck, we're on slide 10.
All right, so in dilutive funding, the company will issue new shares, right, in exchange for the financing coming in, or they'll sell something else that will eventually convert to stock. And this has the effect of diluting or reducing the ownership percentage of the current or starting shareholders. On the other hand, in non-dilutive funding, there's no change in ownership. So the funding will come in and you don't have to give up any of your company or any equity in your company. So non-dilutive funding is pretty awesome if you can find it.
And that's what we'll be doing here today. We're going to be giving tips for how to find it. So that's great. Zach, you're the legal expert here in the room. You've seen a lot of negotiations between founders and investors. Can you talk a little bit about what it is that investors want to get out of an investment, and what founders are worried about, and what they might need to give up to investors?
Sure. I kind of think about it in two categories. One is control and the other is ownership. So from the investor's perspective, they want to make sure that they have veto rights over big decisions such as selling the company, dissolving the company, issuing more shares, or entering into certain strategic transactions. But on the other hand, the founders want to make sure that they can still run their company day to day. They need capital to run the company, and they need some freedom to be able to make decisions without going to their investors for approval for every single item. And on the ownership side, it's a bit more zero-sum game. The founders want to keep as much of the company as possible, while the investors want to buy the most amount of the company through their investment at the best price that they can. And I'll also say too that this is not an adversarial relationship. When you're starting out working with an investor, you're going to be negotiating some of the details on the ownership and control provisions. But at the end of the day, you're entering into a long-term partnership with your investors, and you want to make sure that you're finding the right partner, and that relationship is getting off on the right foot.
Zach, if I can stay with you for another minute, when you're talking about investments, you often hear the words kicked around about the valuation of the company. What's your valuation? What's your pre-money? What's your post-money? What's that mean? And how do you figure out what your valuation is?
Sure. So to put it simply, consider like a pre-money valuation. A pre-money valuation means that you're taking all the ownership rights to the company and putting that in one bucket and giving that a value. And then the investor's investment would come in on top of that. So for the example here, on Shark Tank, you might see, I'll give you 5 million for 20% of your company. So that implies that everything else, stock, options, convertible instruments, is worth 20 million. And then that 5% is going to buy 20% for a 25 million total valuation. It's good to think of the investment as shares, buying shares instead of a percentage. I mean, when you start off with the first investment, it's easy to talk about it in percentages, but really you're issuing shares. As you issue more shares, people get diluted, and the valuation can go up and down, and the percent ownership will change as well as you issue more shares. And I guess the last point just to mention is, when you're thinking about putting your investor mix together, you want to think about making sure that you get enough investors so that you can get the approvals for the items that you need, maybe in a couple different routes. That's helpful so that you don't have one investor controlling the entire company.
So how do you come up with the valuation? Should people go out and get a valuation from a third-party professional?
Yeah, so the deck has a few different examples of how you might go out and try to get a valuation, but at the end of the day, for life science companies, they're so early stage that there's really no one right way to do it. It's really a negotiation between the company and the investor. There's a lot of factors that play into the valuation. For example, how crowded is the field? How good is maybe your preliminary data as a company? Do you have exclusive licenses? Do you have a couple investors that are both negotiating and they both want in on your really hot company? Those are all things that drive the negotiations, but at the end of the day, you want to try and get that number as high as you can as a founder so that you're selling a smaller amount of your company for a higher price.
Deborah, if I can pull you into the conversation, you've invested in a lot of different companies. I'm kind of curious how you as an investor approach the question of valuation, and how do you approach your negotiation with founders of companies? And what advice would you give founders of companies when they're negotiating against you? Are you asking for more than you want? Are you trying to find the right answer? How much posturing is there? What are those valuation negotiations that Zach is describing? How do they actually really unfold?
Yeah, well, the first piece of it is that the negotiation itself is also a part of the due diligence process. And as a VC, I'm watching, how my potential portfolio company CEOs are acting during that negotiation. Are they being incredibly aggressive? Do they have their ducks in a row? Do they know what they're asking for and why they're asking for it? Are they scattered and unorganized? Are they taking the lead? And all these different aspects of how they approach the negotiation itself are also part of our negotiation process. So it's how they come in and how they are negotiating, in addition to what they're actually negotiating for. As far as what posture to take, every VC firm is different. For us, we are an open book at Ecfora Capital. So we will do our own analysis and come up with a range of valuations based on a number of factors. Like Zach mentioned a couple of them earlier. We also look at potential exit, a potential acquisition price, and we also bring that in market size, et cetera. And so we'll have a range of values that we believe are fair market value, and we'll come in and we'll have a discussion with our CEOs and the leadership team of the potential portfolio company to see if there's alignment on the valuation. And I would say, valuation and control, as Zach mentioned, economics and control, those are the two biggest things. If you can get both the valuation and the control or the board of directors correct, then I'd say you're 90% there in most cases. So we make sure that there's alignment on those two factors. And especially in terms of exit, we are pushing for faster exits. And so we want to make sure that there's alignment, not only in terms of cultural fit with the portfolio company and with my firm, but also in terms of where we're headed and what the goal is, and make sure that we're aligned in terms of the other factors that go into the startup life.
So when you're looking at an investment and you're sort of, just making that decision, what influences you the most? Or maybe the answer is it's all important. I mean, in terms of the interactions, and you mentioned that you're watching the management team, you're watching their style, you're watching how they negotiate. Are you, is your investment decision motivated by the team? Is it more motivated by the economics that you're able to negotiate? Or are you more motivated by sort of those control factors that you're able to negotiate?
Well, there's, 1,000 different things that could go wrong in a negotiation, and they all have to go right for it to win. So you do have to have, the cultural fit. You have to have the economics. Ultimately, we are looking to make an amazing change in the world and bring this medical innovation to the market, but we're also looking for returns. And as an investor, our priority and our obligation, our duty, our responsibility is to our investors to deliver a significant return. So we have to make sure that that piece is there. So it is all of it. Some pieces are heavier than others, but you have to have all the pieces in place ultimately to be able to execute an investment.
Great. Thank you. Well, Zach, if I can come back to you, you hear a lot about safes. Safes seem to be all the rage, right? Everybody, at the early stage is talking about their safe investment. What are safes? And, when are they appropriate? How do they work? For those of you following along, we're sort of loosely on slides 14, 15, and 16, talking about the safe overviews.
Sure. So a safe, the name sort of gives it away. It's called a simple agreement for future equity. It basically means that you're giving the investor the right to company equity at some point in the future. But when the money is given to the company and when the safe agreement is signed, equity is not actually issued at that time. And it's also not debt either per se. Convertible debt, more traditional convertible debt, is something that would that could get repaid in the future. Safes typically are not repaid unless there's an exit event before the safe converts into shares. So it's similar, and the idea is that it's supposed to be simpler agreements. They can get a little complicated. But that's the basics. And then as the slide deck mentions, safes are supposed to be faster and cheaper. Sometimes they're not, but a huge benefit is that it gives you more control over your company from a founder's perspective. So I might see a side letter for a safe round. The investor might negotiate certain additional rights, such as a right to invest in the priced round, the preferred round. They might negotiate for the right to better terms on their safe if the company goes and issues a different safe after the investor's safe that has better terms. The investor might have a most favored nations clause that says, hey, you actually have to give me those better terms. But that's all, those don't have to do with control of the company, right? That's not saying that you can't go and, sign $1 million commercial contract or take on this additional debt. The safe leaves a lot of flexibility for the company. And then it also avoids the pricing the company. So some companies are so early stage they don't want to set a valuation yet. It kicks that can down the road. Although we can talk about the terms of the safe, either a cap or discount that sort of imply a valuation as something to keep in mind. And then the QSBS treatment, it likely wouldn't start when you issue the safe. There's some debate about that, but if the investor is concerned about QSBS treatment, stock's always the best way to go to get that treatment from day one.
Okay. Great. No, that's great. That's helpful. So, Zach actually made a really interesting point. I mean, the one nice thing about safes is they defer that valuation question. A lot of times, early stage biotechs and life sciences companies, it's just too early to put a value on. You have no idea what the lead compound is going to be. You have a vague idea of what your indications are going to be. Your compound is so early stage, you don't know when you hit market, what the market size is going to be, what the patient population is going to be, how much of the patient population your device or your therapeutic or your vaccine might be able to protect. A lot of times it's hard to raise money. It's hard to set a price on the company. The investors might look at something that's so young and basically decide that the valuation is going to have to be tiny, $1 million. And if you want to put $1 million, under that the formula that Zach was walking us through, they're getting 50% of the company. And at the same time, the founders might say, look, you're crazy. It's 10 million. You should get 11% of the company, not 50% of the company. So safes are a great way of kicking that valuation discussion down the road. You put your money into a safe, and then a few years later, when things start to crystallize, things start to gel, you know what your IP looks like, you know what the market looks like, you know what the product's actually going to be able to do. Then in a larger priced round with some institutional investors, it's easier to come to an agreement on what a fair valuation is. And then those safes just convert at that future point in time into that equity that those purchasers are buying. And often safes to reward you for that risk of having put that money in early. A lot of times you can buy that equity using the safe at a discount, or maybe there's a cap on the valuation, and the investors get extra shares to reward them for the valuation that's appreciated since the money was put in. I'm going to take a minute and just walk very quickly through equity investments and what they look like. I think that Elizabeth and Zach made the point that when you're selling stock, you're actually printing money. You're giving up ownership in your company. When Elizabeth was talking about dilution in the first place, you're actually selling a percentage of the company. There are two kinds of stock to sell. One is common stock and one is preferred stock. Common stock, it's exactly what the name implies. It's kind of the three musketeers of stock, all for one for all. Everybody's got a vote. Everybody gets an equal share. There's really no advantage one stockholder has over another stockholder with common stock. Sometimes you'd give non-voting common stock to employees, but usually common stock is just a very vanilla ownership piece of the company with no special rights. But preferred stock is different. Preferred stock comes with financial advantages and governance advantages. And I'll spend a little minute talking about that. A lot of times in the very early stages, when you're selling to angel investors, a startup is able to just sell common stock. And everybody sort of has the mindset we're all in this together, starting this enterprise, rolling our sleeves up, and we'll all be treated equally. But when it's time to raise much more substantial amounts of money, institutional investors are going to want you to sell them preferred stock. So we'll talk a little bit about some of the economics of preferred stock, and then I'll talk about the governance of preferred stock. The first key concept to understand with preferred stock is the preferred stockholders will be able to get their money out first. If things go great, if you sell your startup for $500 million, that doesn't matter. Everybody's going to get paid. But if things don't go well, and the downside where you're selling the IP or the compound at a huge discount to how much you've invested in it because it just didn't work, the preferred stockholders will generally get back something called their liquidation preference on the liquidation of the company. Usually they get back the amount of money that they put in. It's usually a one-time liquidation preference. And again, if things go well, usually what happens is they would waive that liquidation preference. That liquidation preference isn't paid to them, and they're treated as if they were common stockholders and if they just shared in everything. They would usually get the higher of either the return of their money or how much they would have gotten if they had just shared in a piece of that global pie. But there's a really important concept. If you don't take anything else away from this next few minutes, it's this piece about participating versus non-participating. It's a critical piece of term sheets that you as investors want to make sure you're thinking about, and you as entrepreneurs and startup CEOs want to make sure you're aware of. There are many investors who will want to get back their investment amount and then also share in the upside. So you get 2 bites at the apple. So there's going to be less left at the end of the day for those founders, for the people holding the common stock, if the investors have participating preferred stock. Non-participating means they get either or. Participating means they get both. The other thing to point out is that liquidation preference doesn't necessarily mean to be just a return of your money. It could be twice your money. It could be 1.5 times the amount of money that you put in. It's usually one time, but especially nowadays in this environment when it's harder to raise money, I'm starting to see some more multiples on liquidation preferences. That downside protection sometimes can be 1.5 or 2 times instead of 1 time. Dividends, you just want to be mindful of dividends. Usually dividends are, if and when declared by the board, there's not usually a right to dividends in any startup, let alone biotech startups. But you see them sometimes. So it's just something you want to keep your eyes open for. You especially want to be careful about cash dividends versus paid in kind dividends. Cash dividend just means that you're going to get a fixed percentage, on a periodic basis every quarter or every year. Paid in kind dividend means that you're going to get stock on that every quarter or every year. And if you're getting stock, that's going to grow faster than if you just got cash, because if you get stock, then you're going to get a dividend on that stock. So that grows faster. So, be wary of dividends. But let's now talk about control rights for a minute. The preferred investors are also going to get certain veto rights over certain corporate actions. Issuances of securities that are senior to what they hold, mergers, liquidations of the company, changing the size of the board, a lot of times the hiring or firing of a CEO, a lot of times the remuneration of the executive team, incurring significant CapEx. A lot of times the stockholders will have the right to approve a lot of those significant corporate actions. So Zach sort of alluded to needing to keep an eye on the profile of your investor base. As investors, you want to be thinking about how, building a coalition of other investors into your round that's going to be able to control what management wants to do. Wearing your management hat, entrepreneurs out there are going to be wanting to think about building a coalition of investors that gives you multiple paths to trying to get approvals for the actions that you want to take. Usually, these actions require a majority or a supermajority of the round that's being raised. So usually it's about 2/3. Sometimes it can be a majority, sometimes it can be 75%. But there's a lot of game theory to building the profile of investors and who the friendlies are to try and get in place, like I said, a path to getting those approved. There are a lot of other rights that attach to preferred stock. You get rights of participation. You get, in the event of a change of control of the company, the key investors might have the right to drag along some of the other investors. But I think the takeaway from this slide for everybody is there's an organization called the National Venture Capital Association that has a very well-developed suite of documents that define all of these rights. And the vast majority of venture deals are done using these documents that all lay out these rights really precisely. So as you're out raising money, you want to make sure that you're working with your attorneys and your other advisors, your business development advisors, to understand what those NVCA documents would provide for and how they work, and how you want to build the terms of what you're selling to these stockholders. It all sounds very technical, but as CEOs, you want to make sure that you really understand rock solid what it is that you're selling to these investors, because they will then be able to use those documents to control you and to control your company. So having said that, Elizabeth, let me turn to you. You've been in startups. You've helped a lot of different startups. As you're sort of wearing your entrepreneur hat. I know that you can understand where investors are coming from, but at the same time, you want autonomy to be able to do what it is that the management team know best how to grow the company. So how do you, as an entrepreneur trying to raise money, how do you balance their understandable desire for control versus your understandable desire for autonomy?
Right. So as an earlier stage startup company, we work with our CEOs to raise hopefully smaller amounts of initial capital for, say, the Series A, such that the founders and the executive team does retain the majority of the company. Eventually, as you go into bigger rounds, you are going to give up that control. But at the earlier stages, the executive team wants to keep control of the company. And it's also actually an important piece of the SBIR as well, which we'll talk about later, that any one VC shouldn't own more than 50% of the company. So initially, of course, the founders want to preserve the majority ownership. And it's important, as Deborah said, to ideally choose an investor that you have a really good relationship with, because it will be hopefully a really long-term relationship, and hopefully they'll come back and they'll reinvest and continue to be a partner with you in future rounds. So you need to develop during the diligence process two-way respect and trust with the investors. And what else do I want to say? We would as a small company in early rounds of investment, we're actually looking forward to having the VCs be around the table with us, hopefully in observational seats, but likely voting seats as well, because we want to leverage that know-how that the VCs are bringing and their networks. So this is great expertise coming into the company, and we definitely want to get as much out of that as we can. And of course, we understand that the VCs want to have as much information about the company. And I personally think it's really important for the CEO to keep that lines of communication open and like really freely open with the investors. So I think it's important to communicate way more frequently than say quarterly. I would go for every 2 weeks, even every 1 week, if you can, just to provide updates. This is what we're doing, the good stuff and the bad stuff. I think everyone should be on the same page, and I think be as transparent as possible. So
Great.
I think that would be a lot, but it's really important.
So Deborah, turning to you, what's your take? Sort of wearing the investor hat. I guess I'll throw the same question right at you. What's the balance that you like to strike between providing the company with autonomy versus having an element of control?
Yeah, so it comes down really to three things, and those are trust, alignment, and risk. So if you are completely aligned with the founder and you have a very clear picture of where you're going and you understand the elements of risk that are in place, then you can lean more towards autonomy. But as that balance shifts, then you have to shift accordingly. And, Jay, earlier in the call, you mentioned the $1 million company. If you have a company that's worth $1 million, it's going to be in a much smaller, earlier, more fragile stage than a more established company. And so in that scenario, you would be leaning more towards the autonomy. And I'm sorry, more towards the control and less towards the autonomy. But as the startups progress in their journey, you think of it like children, like a child. As a child grows up, they have more freedom and they're more able to make their own decisions and execute on the plan that you've agreed to with them. And so the same thing happens in the startup scene. As the startups progress and they strengthen, then the risk goes down and the trust goes up, and therefore the balance is able to shift more towards autonomy in that case.
That's great. Thank you. Thank you so much. Steve, if I can turn to you, you have advised just a lot of entrepreneurs, a lot of companies. You've mentored a lot along the way, you've participated in a lot. What should biotechs be doing in terms of making themselves attractive? And we're sort of going to bridge into the grant side of things now, but also making themselves as attractive as possible to investors, as well as to non-dilutive funders. What's your advice?
I think the slide you have here is really important. It's really the intellectual property underpinning, particularly for early stage companies. I don't think you can really underestimate it. It's really kind of going to be the lifeblood. It's the asset that is not going to walk out the door at 5 o'clock each night. Other assets, human assets, are important. But this is going to be the staying power, the thing that's going to attract the long-term investment, the larger investment. And so if you're a small company, you really need to pay attention to, many of the companies that we work with, they don't have a lot of physical assets, in terms of buildings or equipment or such, maybe that's leased or rented. But they do spend a lot of money on intellectual property because that's really going to be the thing that comes out most frequently in due diligence by investors. So I think in terms of this, if it's projects that you own, intellectual property that you own, you make sure that it's within the hands of a good intellectual property attorney. In life sciences, if you really want as broad as coverage as possible in terms of the major markets, not necessarily just the United States. In terms of that, so it does take some investment and cost for that. And also, if you're bringing the technology in from, say, a federal lab or a university, you want to do a little bit of checking on the status of that and make sure that it's carefully reviewed and taking a look at the assignments. to make sure that what you are licensing is actually assigned. If it's, if it has some government funding with that, have they reported it properly through the and making sure that everything is really in place, because you don't want to have this thing pop up later when it comes time to talk to Deborah or other investors who find that your intellectual property is not what you think it is.
That's great. That's great. In terms of sharing equity and allocating equity amongst the founders, how do you what kind of marriage counseling do you do with some of the entrepreneurs that you work with? And I guess I'll throw this really open to anybody. What's in terms of incentivizing employees, how important is it for you to see a strong cap table, versus a weak cap table? Are there warning signs that can jump out for you?
Well, one thing I would mention, if you're working with the federal government, is that we won't be wanting equity in your company. We won't be messing up your cap table. So that keeps it a little fresher, a little more more of the pie available to attract investors, to attract employees. So I think that's one of the things that we'll talk about a little bit later is, non-equity type programs that then free it up for these types of activities.
Zach, what do you see in terms of vesting? How important is vesting to investors, and what does that usually end up looking like? And what is vesting?
Yeah, so vesting is the idea that you retain the right to your shares as a founder over time. So if you're issued 5,000 shares when the company's formed, for example, the standard vesting would be 4-year vesting with a 1-year cliff. So that means that if you leave the company as the founder before that first year, that 1-year cliff, you actually don't get to keep your shares. You have to stay with the company for at least 1 year, and then you vest in 25% of your shares. Of course, that shows an odd number, but 1.25 million shares would vest, and then the remaining shares would vest over 3 years every month after that. And I think it's that VCs do care a lot about that. I mean, they want to make sure that the founder is invested for the long haul, and that's one way that they make sure that happens. And they're investing in people, right? They're investing in technology, but they're also investing in your team. So it's important that the team stays together and people are incentivized to stay with the company for, at least a few years, if not longer.
Great. So, so far we've been talking a lot about, people putting money into the company, right? Which is usually going to turn into equity. And we've been talking a lot about that dilutive funding. But there's a lot of sources of non-dilutive funding as well. And, one of the ones that I hear about the most are SBIRs and STTRs, which is just, an alphabet soup of letters. Elizabeth, what are SBIRs? What are STTRs? How do they work? How do you get them? What benefits, what constraints?
Sure. So I consider this federal grant program to be the largest public venture capital initiative, and it's, as it says, funded by the federal government. So it's a pretty amazing pot of money that's available. I'd like to say the mission is to support scientific excellence and technological innovation through the investment of federal research funds in critical American priorities to build a strong national economy. So a lot of, DOD, NIH, NSF are the biggest federal agencies that have the most amount of money going into these programs. So as far as eligibility goes for gaining these grants, you have to be a small U.S. business concern. It has to be an incorporated business, and it has to be for profit. It has to be at least 50% owned by a U.S. citizen and less than 500 employees. And as I mentioned before, any single VC can't own more than 50% of the company. And there's all kinds of other minutia rules. Those are like the big ones, right? And
So-
as yeah.
Oh, no, go ahead. Go ahead. No, I think you were about to actually answer the question I was about to ask. I was about to ask about the difference between SBIRs and STTRs, and I think you were about to go there.
Actually, I wasn't, but I think it's written right here. So for STTR, the small business needs to partner with a university. That's usually what happens. And then a certain percentage of the work, at least 30% of the work, has to be done by the university, and the balance is done by the company.
Got it. Do you have those same ownership restrictions with respect to both programs?
No, they're different for SBIR. So you pick and choose the one that fits your PIs the best.
Okay. Okay. So if you could tell us just a little bit about, what monies are available for SBIR and how do you apply and how does that application process work?
So the first time you apply, there's a lot of lead work that you have to do. You have to make sure you're registered with the SBA, make sure you're registered with the SAM system of the federal government. And yeah, there's lots of background paperwork you got to get going before you can apply. Once all that stuff is in place, application calendar application dates for DoD, NSF, and NIH are all different. And actually, the application instructions are different. So you really have to choose which agency you're going to go with and make sure you follow their rules and their calendar and all of that. So they're quite different. But in common, they do have the phase 1, the phase 2, and some have a phase 2B, and some have a commercialization readiness program. So the phase 1 is supposed to be about 12 months, and it's supposed to be about you have 250K here for NIH, I guess. These are not hard caps. And then for the phase 2, so you're moving along. The phase 2 in my companies is often the animal toxicology and the filing of the pre-IND. So yeah. And then phase 3, you have commercialization. No SBIR funds are available for that. However, at least in NIH, some of the bigger institutes like NCI and NHLBI have a phase 2B. So that can't be used for commercialization, but it can be used for more expensive things like toxicology and manufacturing. And then also NIH has this commercialization readiness, and that can again be, gosh, I think it goes up to $1 million, and that can be spent on things like consulting and lawyers and other things that are really gearing you up for the commercialization. The other thing to really keep in mind, sorry, about these is that there's the money is slow to come in. So you really have to think about your timelines and how much you're raising and when the money's coming in and how you're going to fill these gaps. Because the phase 1, it could be, up to 9-10 months after you've put in the submission when the award actually comes in. And there's often another big gap between the completion of your phase 1, you're applying for the phase 2, and that phase 2 money might not come in for a year or a year and a half. So you really have to be aware of the timelines associated with these grants.
Got it. Great tip. Is there an art to matching your technology, your company, your compound with an agency? Is there a way of finding out what agent, are some agencies more likely to fund some technologies than others? How do you navigate that decision?
Yeah, absolutely. So I depend and rely very heavily on the NIH reporter. All my work is in drug therapeutics, but go to NIH reporter. It's incredible database. You can search all kinds of different ways, slice and dice, and you know, you can put in your SBIR abstract and then ask it to search which institutes have funded something similar and how much money did they put in. And I mean, you can find out all sorts of information in the NIH reporter and really identify what institute is most likely to fund you, and even within that institute, which subgroup, I forget the exact terminology, is most likely to fund within that. So yeah, all that information is publicly available in a beautiful database. Yeah.
Great, great. Steve, can you tell us a little bit about NIH and collaborative research agreements and what they are and how they work and how you enter into them?
Sure. So this is a special program that was authorized by Congress back in 1986. We're coming up to the 40th anniversary of this program, so I think people should really think about taking even further advantage of it. And it's basically a way for companies to collaborate with federal labs, not just NIH and other federal scientists, in a manner that the work then with your company becomes part of the federal scientists' official duties. So there's no conflict of interest issues. It's part of their job to do work on this project. So these typically are things that are of mutual interest. And they put together a joint research program. And what's nice about it is that the costs often are shared. So it's a joint collaboration, and often the federal lab will bring resources to the table, as well as the company. And what's nice is if there is a discovery made during this collaboration by the federal scientist, the company or their partner receives an exclusive option to that technology without having to go through a competitive process. So it's a way to sort of jumpstart certain projects that you have that are of interest also to that particular investigator. At the same time, then tee that up in terms of commercialization, because the federal lab will need a commercial partner for any inventions made from the program anyway. So it's interesting that people can take advantage of this. It's fairly flexible in terms of the types of programs, both either preclinical or clinical work. And I think that's something that small companies particularly small companies, should take advantage of, because of the way to kind of leverage the resources that they already have.
Are there application periods? Are there deadlines? Is it sort of a more informal?
So this isn't a grant program. So there isn't a sort of a formal deadline or process. It's really more about an investigator, a scientist having a meeting. So have to kind of play matchmaker here and try to match up the interest of what could be a strategic program at your company with something that's of interest to a particular investigator. So it's then useful to check, to use Elizabeth's example, NIH Reporter, to see which NIH investigators are doing certain types of projects, for example, or from the published literature. And then you have an idea of who to approach, or which institute, which program. And it's not just NIH, it's also other federal labs as well have this. So you could think a little broader than just NIH in terms of these types of collaborations. But again, it's a way to sort of have the federal government do work with you, supporting your efforts, but not requiring any loss of equity in terms of receiving that sort of support.
Great, thank you. There's another program that I hadn't been aware of until recently, the Congressional Directed Medical Research Programs. Tell us a little bit about that. How does that work?
Sure.
What is it? How do you get into that?
So this has an interesting history. As the slide says, it started in 1992. It's basically the money that Congress decided to invest in research, but not give NIH and not give NSF. And it allows Congress to identify some very specific projects that they're interested in. It's managed by the Department of Defense. And the funding is substantial in terms of sort of the amounts of money for often equivalent to SBIR Phase 2 awards. I think it'd be the closest analysis. So often in millions of dollars. And so each year, Congress picks a certain number of topics, and while these do have applications for veterans or for the military, they also have significant civilian applications as well. So again, this is another thing to be thinking about in terms of putting together collaborations, often with universities. So we see companies partner with universities for this, or sometimes companies putting the projects together themselves for this. It's a little bit different than SBIR in that there's no particular pay line. It's really more about more filling strategic gaps in certain areas of science and development, particularly in medical research. So I think it's an important thing for people to consider.
Great, great. Thank you. I'm sorry, I'm going to come back to you one more time. Tell us about CRADAs. Where do CRADAs fit into all of this, and how are they different from those prior two programs? When you were describing the collaborative research agreements, I was sort of thinking about CRADAs and thinking, well, this sounds pretty similar to the CRADA program. So I was wondering what the differences were between the collaborative research agreements and the CRADAs.
Well, I guess they're one and the same in that we do have collaborative agreements, and we also have CRADAs. With CRADAs would be involved with intellectual property rights. Well, you can have formal and informal collaboration agreements that would not speak to intellectual property rights. So the main thing for CRADAs would be that if you think that intellectual property rights could result from that work, and then you would have the CRADA format. If you did not think intellectual property rights would result, that the simple collaboration agreement would be that. And CRADA is also a way to help fund the federal lab. Most of the time, the federal lab does not need funding. That's already a congressional appropriation. But sometimes the investigators could use additional funding for postdoctoral fellows to help work on this new project that they're working on with you. So that's the most typical funding that we see for CRADA, or sometimes shared cost in terms of a clinical trial.
Great, thank you. Elizabeth, let me turn to you for a minute. A lot of federally funded research, the federal government has reserved rights called march-in rights. In theory, it has the right to practice some of the inventions that have been funded using federal research. In the investor context, in the M&A context, do people get worried about those march-in rights? Is it something that's come up? But in terms of recent developments, we've recently seen the administration talk about a desire to exercise march-in rights, or to rely on them more heavily, or under Bayh-Dole to perhaps assert ownership rights over some of the inventions that have been created at universities, and be a little bit more aggressive in taking back inventions where maybe the I's haven't been dotted or the T's haven't been crossed. As an entrepreneur, as a startup, what advice do you have for us about how universities can make sure they stay compliant? How would exercise of march-in rights impact you? How would you get investors comfortable? What should investors be worried about when they're thinking about march-in rights?
Yeah. So the Bayh-Dole Act, which really allowed the universities to partake in tech transfer activities. So that was mid-80s, 84 maybe. But anyway, so I started doing tech transfer in the 90s. And in the 90s, yes, the pharmaceutical partners and investors were concerned about the march-in rights. And it was always a question. And our answer always was, the government has never exercised this. And now it's been 30 years and still the answer is the same. The government, as far as I know, the government has never exercised the walk-in rights. So yes, our current federal government is making a lot of noise about doing that in their whatever negotiations with Harvard. So yeah, so they're politicizing the margin rights. It really threatens the predictability of the patent incentives. It could put a chill on university industry partnerships. Of course, a lot of these biotechs are spin-outs from universities. We've exclusively licensed university patents into our company. As Steve said, it's the backbone and the value of the company. So yeah, it's critical for us to be able to assure our investors that we have control of these, and it's incredibly unlikely that the government's going to march in. So until this whole Harvard thing came up, people rarely, in my experience, rarely talk about or discuss the putative margin rights. But for the universities, it is critically important for them, margin rights aside, the universities are responsible for making sure all those patent assignments are in place and executed appropriately. And they also do need to, I mean, any inventions or patents that were partially or funded in any way from any federal government grant money, they need to put a statement in the patent that says the government may have some rights to this, blah, blah, blah. And the university also dockets all of these inventions into the iEdison system. So most universities that are worth their salt will have an employee whose job is to make sure that all of this patent information is consistently and continually uploaded into iEdison, and they are compliant with everything required through the Bayh-Dole Act. So what other part of your question did I miss?
No, that's perfect. That's actually really helpful. So, we're coming down to the end of the hour. In a minute, I'm going to ask everybody, if you've got any closing thoughts for strategies for startups in raising money, whether it's dilutive or non-dilutive, how to position yourself, how to find money. Before we get there, I'll just note a couple of other slides. One thing for startups to keep in mind is there are a lot of philanthropic grants out there. If you're studying a rare disease, developing a therapeutic or a diagnostic for something, there may be an organization out there that funds research, has access to patients, builds awareness for the program. You definitely want to do some deep research into your disease area and find out what groups are out there. Even if they may have money for grants, they may have money for research grants. Even if they don't, they likely have access to a body of patients that can make recruitment for trials easier, or you can find out more about clinical endpoints that might be useful for your own clinical trials, or you can find out more about what day-to-day lives are to refine your medical device to better fit the needs of those patients. So you definitely want to keep in mind these charitable and philanthropic organizations out there who may be really great sources of, if not money, other non-monetary resources. The other thing that I would point out is, as you get a little bit further along, there are absolutely opportunities to partner with large pharma or larger device companies. They may fund your research. You enter into a partnership. Each of you are performing development activities, and there be maybe upfronts and milestones and royalties associated with that. You may well be able to stay involved and participate and have some commercialization rights, but at the same time, you may be able to get part of your development efforts funded by that pharma. Or if you've got a platform, maybe you're getting, one aspect of, one indication paid for. Maybe you've out licensed one indication, you're still working, but you've got other indications that you're working on, and you can use the data that you develop with one strategic collaboration, or the formulation or lessons learned in the other programs for the same platform that you've left behind. So, we've reached the end of our hour. I really appreciate, everybody joining us for an engaging discussion. Any closing thoughts from the panelists?
I'll just throw out, if you're looking at doing a price round or raising money from investors on a SAFE or a convertible note, a good attorney would also be a business partner. They can give you feedback on terms and help you understand the investor's perspective, as well as your own. And if you're looking for data, Cooligo, while they're a competitor, they do have some good venture financing data on their website. And Carta has good private market summaries where you can take a look at the current terms out in the market.
Okay. Well, everybody, thank you for a really engaging discussion. I apologize. We have reached the end of our hour. We do need to end here. We didn't hit quite all the points raised on all of our slides. So for those of you listening in, please definitely log into Financial Poise, download the deck, review it for further information. I want to thank Deborah Hemingway. I want to thank Zach Mueller, Steve Ferguson, and Elizabeth Smith. Thank you so much to our panelists for joining us today. And thanks to all of you in the audience for joining us. Really appreciate your participation. And our next session is going to be on intellectual property and the role that it plays in life sciences companies. So we look forward to talking to you then. Thank you so much.
Thank you.